Hi, everyone. I'm BJ. I'm a genealogist in Maine. And so I'm going to talk tonight about genealogy, as I often do. And tonight I'm going to talk about something that we all run into eventually. And it's when you have two records that say two different things about when an ancestor was born, where they were born, what first name was, what the person's name was. Um, and how do we go about figuring out which piece of evidence we want to go with? Now, obviously, there are things like DNA can show you that the man on the birth record is not a person's father. And there's stuff like that that is big. But most of what I'm going to talk about today are things that seem little, but it's frustrating because you might have two different places of birth. And part of what you need to think about is, does it matter? And if it does matter, how can you figure out which is the more reliable record? So let me start sharing my screen so you can see this and what I talk about will make sense. So let's get things set up here. Okay. The one thing you can't do when you have conflicting evidence is you can't ignore it, because if you do, it means that it's really hard to draw any conclusions from your data if you don't have solid evidence. And often things like this are cases of how do you get further back then? And if you've got a wrong birthplace or wrong age, things like that, you're going to find that it makes it harder to do further research. Now, sometimes, and we'll see cases here where you have direct evidence, two pieces of direct evidence in a written record saying this person was born in place X, and that this person was born in place Y. For example, those of you who've been around a while and have seen my whole Chasing Harriet with Harriet Waterman, um, I have three possible birthplaces in records for her. One is just Hillsborough, New Hampshire. And the other two are Chicopee and Springfield, Massachusetts. I'm not that worried about the Chicopee versus Springfield because she was born about a year and a half to 2 years before Chicopee split off from Springfield as a separate town. And so that may actually be a case where it doesn't really matter, because it may have been Springfield when she was born, and then by the time she was answering a question about where she was born, the exact place she was born was then in Chicopee. They're adjoining towns. As I said, they split right at the time that it would be confusing about when she was born. But that Massachusetts, Springfield or Chicopee versus Hillsborough, New Hampshire, is one I haven't been able to figure out yet. I've got good evidence for both of those in terms of things where someone who should have known was the one who gave the answers on the record. Sometimes you'll have a piece of what seems to be direct evidence, but you'll have other evidence that um, is either indirect or negative. For example, when I first started out as a baby genealogist, I had information about my dad's family that my grandmother had written, but she had died 25 years before I was interested in this. And she had death dates in the late 1870s for my grandfather's grandparents. And by the 1870s, civil registration in Scotland really was pretty close to universal. And the fact that I was missing two people meant either the name had been completely butchered somehow, and it was Patterson, so I didn't think it was going to be that bad, or they didn't die in Scotland. And it turns out that they indeed did not die in Scotland. Um, my dad and his siblings had no memory of this, but the cousins they'd gone to visit when they were young were actually descendants of the, my my grandparents' grandparents, and they had actually come to Canada and then the US and died in the US and are buried in a little town in Western New York. But somehow my dad and his sisters didn't have, they knew that they had cousins. They just didn't know that their great grandparents had also immigrated to the US. And then the really tough one is when you have both two different types of indirect or negative evidence because you're really trying to put together something with lots of circumstantial evidence. So, you end up doing a lot of thinking about how do these records go together? And you can't necessarily say, well, there are 17 pieces of information that say A and three that say B, so A is right. I mean, I didn't put it in this program, but I have that whole evolution of the Ithamar Wilkins record where it's a mistake in the 1840s copying that gets put in the vital records book. But if you go back to the 1830s-ish record for something that happened in the 18 teens, it has different evidence. Um, so that's the sort of thing you need to think about because almost everybody in the online trees has the mistake from the 1840s copy. I'm going to show you at least a couple cases here where there's an explanation of why something isn't consistent. And once we have an explanation, say a cultural reason, it makes much more sense. So one of the fairly prominent genealogists, as genealogy is becoming much more rigorous, he was named Harold Henderson, and he talks about sort of the 6 stages of when you're dealing with things that contradict each other. One is you actually have to notice it, that you're paying enough attention that you notice that Harriet Waterman's death record says she was born in Hillsborough, New Hampshire, but all that her marriage record says she was born in Springfield, Massachusetts. And then I said, you need to make sure it matters. So that's like the Springfield Chicopee bit. You need to keep looking because it's really easy, especially with online stuff these days, with the first, you find 3 records that agree and you figure you're done. Then analyzing it, how could this have happened? Is it poorly informed informant? Is it a copying mistake? Is it different jurisdictions? Is one the county and one's the town? And so that analyzing and correlating it. And then he ends with, and this is true of a lot of these, that your best finally way to make sure you're making sense is just try to write it out to explain it to somebody else. Um, it's really important to be able to say, yeah, I thought this, but the evidence is leading me that way. Um, and looking at a variety of um, sources. For example, if you have a death record, a cemetery record, a tombstone, and an obituary, you might think that's 4 records, but it may all be out of one record. It may be one person filling out the death record that gets given to the cemetery and the undertaker, and then you know, the someone in that sphere is the one who sends the obituary in. And so it's really all just it's actually one record in 4 different forms. And so that's one of the things to think about is, are these records actually separate or are they in a way duplicates of something? Um, Documentation, I will tell you, I don't have an example of one of the things I'm going to talk about because I know I have documented it somewhere because it's part of my certification portfolio. And could I find that record today? No, because, unfortunately, my office here at home looks like an office supply store exploded in here with everything I brought home from the library office. And it's here somewhere. I'm not worried about it. I can find it again if I'm not rushing to do this. But write down where you find stuff because it may someday make a difference. And it's also worth remembering what the goal is. The goal is to be able to establish someone's identity, you know, name, places, events, relationships, to see if you can confirm your family stories. And as I said, prove relationships. You know, just gathering dates and places for most of us is not the final step. Elizabeth Shown Mills, in one of her books, talks about um, what I used to have a colleague who called weasel words, but they're actually very handy, this list, to think about how confident are you of what you're looking at and how you've put things together. Is it something that is pretty clear and straightforward and you're willing to bet some money on it? And the difference between certainly and probably might be the difference between being willing to bet 20 bucks and 10 bucks. And then you get down to apparently and perhaps, and it might be a dime. But I sometimes put this up and I think, I sit there and go, each of these pieces of evidence I have about this person, where would I put them on this scale? And there are things that I would certainly put in the certainly or probably, and then other bits about the person in the apparently or maybe slash perhaps. And so sometimes just um, it helps you think about how firm you are on something. So that's why I put this scale in because it is part of the, you know, how certain are you? And it's good to sometimes step back and say, okay, let's pretend I'm not certain. Where else would I look for evidence if I'm not certain? So as I said, sometimes we have to make sure it matters. Um, and I get people, the spelling of the last name is different. They find somebody listed as Patsy when the name they thought the person was Martha. Well, Patsy was a nickname for Martha. Um, Sally was a nickname for Sarah. Um, Peggy for Margaret. And so that may or may that often that sort of thing. And you find somebody in the records as Bobby instead of Robert, and that's probably not something you need to spend a whole lot of time on. Um, this is one of these, Cheryl. This is where I said you can't answer. So one of my ancestors married Joseph Poor, or was named Joseph Poor. He married Eliza Monroe, and these are some 6 records I have for him with an indication of where it happened. What question should you be asking at this point about these 3 places? Did he move a lot? Well, the answer actually is no. He lived in the same house his entire life. And here's what happened. He was born and got married in Danvers. In 1855, what had been the South Parish of Danvers since the 1750s was set off as the town of South Danvers. And then in 1868, they chose to rename the town to Peabody after the local man who did good. And actually, the libraries in both Danvers and Peabody are named after Peabody as well. Um, so he never moved. He literally lived in the same house his whole life, but where the house was changed, not geographically, but in terms of the jurisdiction. And so you do get that, especially as you get people moving west and north in New England. You get things that change name. And so that's one of the things you want to be aware of. Just like with my Chicopee and Springfield example, you're not going to find birth records for Chicopee in the 1820s because it wasn't a town until the mid 1830s. And I've had people come in and say, looking for this person. It turns out, they're looking in Peabody at a time it should be Danvers, because the records go with where they were created, for the most part. So this is interesting. I'm part of a group that picks apart a National Genealogical Society quarterly article every month. And the one we did this week, it was an interesting question. What was the name of Conrad Peters' wife? And these are some of the samples of what name she had in records. But you'll notice that you've got them interspersed. So it's not like he had a first wife, Gertrude, and a second wife, Catherine, because you've got Gertrude, Catherine, Gertrude, Catherine, Gertrude, Catherine, Gertrude, Catherine. Well, here's where a little knowledge comes in handy. Those of us out of English-speaking backgrounds, more than one given name is pretty much a phenomenon of the last 200 years. Before 1800-ish, 1790 in Massachusetts, you almost never get a middle name for anybody. But in Germany, France, Spain, Italy, you often got two names. And so there's a pretty good chance that this woman was actually baptized Gertrude Catherine, or the German equivalent. And so what would have happened was the Gertrude was first, and it was used in religious contexts. There's a good chance the name of her godmother was Gertrude. That's often what happened. But her call name, or the name she used in everyday life and in secular society, was Catherine. So this is one of those things that you want to double check, but in the sense of this is not two separate women. You're not having to pull out two women. Then there's one of my favorite ancestors, William Lowe Weston. He was an early member of the New England Historical and Genealogical Society. He died in 1889 in Danvers, Massachusetts. And in 1943, he had a memorial in the Register, which has a whole bunch of errors. And we're going to look at a couple of them. We have what I think is a fairly certain birth date for him. When he gets married and has kids in Danvers, it says he was born in Boston. And then on his death record, it says he was born in Brooklyn, New Hampshire. So let's take a look. So here's this is that register style that a lot of New England states use, where you get the married couple and their information, and then the kids, and you can see when the clerk changed on this by the handwriting change. And here you see time and place of birth, Boston. Well, it turns out he was not born in Boston. It's where he lived for a couple years before he went to Danvers, but it's not where he was born. And then here's his death record, which I'm already skeptical about because it really kind of looks like they call him William L. Western. That's certainly how it's been indexed. And I have to remind myself every time I go into this to find it that it's Western and not Weston in the index. Um, and died of pneumonia. He was retired. And here, born Brooklyn, New Hampshire. And then there was that bit about whether it was James or Samuel, and it really doesn't work for either because the J certainly looks like the first letter in his father's name. But if you look at how he ends words with an S, like with Danvers, that certainly doesn't look like an S to end James. So, you know, I'm a little skeptical about the whole death record here. But as you can see here, you can see this better where that looks like it's sort of halfway between James and Samuel. Um, then we have a little plot twist. Census records, 1850 and 70 here. Born in Pennsylvania. 1880, born in Pennsylvania. Both parents born in Pennsylvania. Well, I can tell you this much. He was born in Pennsylvania. His parents, on the other hand, were born in Connecticut. This took years of research to narrow down finally. Um, so that's a case where you know, you often think of the census as less accurate because who knows who the informant was. Well, in this case, it's kind of accurate. And it's what got me when I looked at that and I saw the Pennsylvania and I'd seen the Brooklyn, New Hampshire. I was like, I wonder if there's a Brooklyn, Pennsylvania. And guess what? There is indeed a Brooklyn, Pennsylvania. And that's where, so each of these records had a bit. He'd been in Boston for a while before he moved to Danvers. He was born in a town called Brooklyn, and he was born in Pennsylvania. So each of them has a little bit of the truth. Here's one, and I have it up here, and I realized you couldn't really read it, so I blew it up. This is my great-grandfather, Peter McGee's father, Francis McGee, so my great-great-grandfather. And on the 1851 census in Edinburgh, Scotland, it says he was born in Fermanagh. County only doesn't help that much, but it's better than nothing. I have no idea who the informant was on this. However, if we look at this, and I know you can't read this, so I'm going to blow it up. This is an 1855 birth registration where they asked for lots of, it was the first year of civil registration in Scotland, and they asked for lots of extra information. And this says Donegal, which is, the other side of the border with Fermanagh for a little bit. And you'll notice here, he is actually the informant, although he makes his mark, he's probably not literate. And so I'm leaning towards Donegal for two reasons. One is I still think that there's a slight chance that this is not Fermanagh, but it's the name of some little farm or townland, because it's so hard to read. But if I had to pick one, because I know he's the informant on this, and it could be a neighbor, could be a landlord, could have been his wife, could have, who knows, on the census. But those are the only two clues I have to where he came from. You saw this one last week. This is a case where, again, Scottish women legally kept their maiden name. And so what looks like a discrepancy is actually just that tradition. But we're also going to look at Elizabeth Little here. This is my great great grandmother, here she is at 13, called Elizabeth Little. And as you can see, I just out of this one census entry, I can sort of pick out this family tree. But here's where it gets interesting. In 1861, they're down in southern Scotland, the family. They're in the just out between the cities of Hawick and Selkirk. But it does say here that Elizabeth and her older brother were born at Galsby in Sutherlandshire. And so I was like, hmm. So I went looking up there, found William Little and Margaret Greig. I went through that last week. Um, but then, so here you see Galsby clearly. But then 20 years later, it says she's born in Farr, also in Sutherland, but different parish. And this is northern Scotland. For those of you who know the area, Inverness is just a little south of where this map is cut off. And this is Galsby, and this is Farr. Today, it's about a 2-hour ride, and that's if you don't get behind a truck or a herd of sheep, because it
Hmm.
can take longer if you get behind a truck or a herd of sheep. Um, so if you get behind a truck or a herd of sheep, you can just appreciate how gorgeous northern Scotland is. But it's not quite as bad as it seems, because if you look here, you see the parish of Farr comes way down here, and Golspie actually goes up a little more than this looks like. So they're not too far apart at this end. But it turns out, I figured out, I did find her baptismal record in Farr at a non-conformist, at a dissenting church, the Free Church of Scotland, not the Church of Scotland. And it was way up here on the coast. I've seen the building. But it turns out they were actually living on a farm in the parish of Tongue when she was born. So she was baptized in Farr. Her parents met, let me do this in order. Her parents met in Golspie. I'm not sure where they were married. I have not found a marriage record for them. But they met in Golspie. She was born in Tongue and baptized in Farr. So I can sort of reconcile all of those. And so, not knowing who the informant was, maybe it was grandma who just Farr and Goldsby were they were just the other end of the country and who cared. Um, so yeah, so she was born here, um, and then baptized up at that little church. Um, so that's a case where I kept researching until I found something that worked. And the baptismal record had the name of the um, place they were living. So then here we have her again. She's married to Edward Arthur. And what's interesting here is it gives her the last name Arthur, but has as her first name Little, her maiden name. So who knows how this got messed up. What's interesting is this is actually, I don't know if they've changed it because I've written to both of them. It had been indexed as Settle and not Little, but I did corrections for both of them, um, so that you could see that. So another case I was helping someone with, and we found the family, parents are Polish immigrants. In 1910, they have a 6-year-old daughter, Leocadia. 10 years later, they have a 15-year-old daughter, Lizzie. And 10 years after that, they have a 26-year-old daughter, Charlotte. And so my guess on this and the person I was working with, I think, agreed with me. Leocadia is the name she's given by her parents who are still speaking Polish. Um, it's, I think, a Polish saint's name. It's fairly common. 1920, she's a teenager experimenting with anglicizing her name. And then for some reason, she settles on Charlotte. Now, it's possible she'd settled on Charlotte by this point, and the census taker meant to write Lottie and wrote Lizzie. I don't know. But we went through the process of this is the same daughter, even though the names do change, because all of the other daughters are accounted for with names that don't change as much. So this is just something to think about that, particularly if you have ancestors who were not native speakers of English and they're anglicizing their names, you may get things like this. And you may get teenage girls playing around with their name. I know I did as a teenager. I expect all of you know someone who as a teenager thought she wanted to go by a different name and either stuck with it or reverted to her original name. So just something to think about. Now here's the one where I couldn't find the entry I wanted, but I can tell you about it. So I was doing this for a friend, and here's her great grandmother, Minnie Driscoll, born in Ireland in 1877, living the edges of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Um, Getting married, she's 19. So at this point, the age to get married was 21. So she gets married with the consent of Sylvester Driscoll. And it would be really easy to go, okay, so who's her father? Sylvester Driscoll. But as I kept poking around, I found a couple things that didn't make sense if that was the case. Her death record was no help. It just says Driscoll for the name of father and unknown for the name of the mother. And it's her daughter who is the informant. So, you know, and the daughter's not is only about 15 at this point. So she's, that's no help. So I look and I find Sylvester Driscoll and his wife Ellen. This is their passenger record coming over. And this is at a point where Minnie would have been about 11 years old. She's not with them. So I'm like, well, maybe they left her there with grandparents and she came later. So I kept looking. Here we have Sylvester at the same address that Minnie's at various points. So, obviously they are connected. And then this is the 1900 census, where they ask women how many children they had. And Ellen says she's had no children. And it's the only marriage for both of them, as far as I can tell. And if you do the numbers, they were married before Minnie was born. So it's not that there's a previous spouse for one of them. Well, it turns out that Sylvester's brother Timothy was Minnie's father. And on the day before she got married, she actually went to the orphans court, and this is the record I wasn't finding today, in Allegheny County, and Sylvester Driscoll was named her legal guardian. She'd come from Ireland on her own, come to the US and started working and all of that when she was 18 or 19. But she couldn't get married without consent from her father. And since her father wasn't there, they went to the orphans court and Sylvester was named her guardian so that she could get married legally. But, it would be easy to think, oh, no kids, maybe this is wrong. But, when you do the math and they were married before Minnie was born and all of this, it now makes sense that she went to uncles. She wanted to leave Ireland. She was one of several kids in a fairly poor area of Ireland, and so she went to her uncle's. So what's interesting is later, after Ellen has died, this is Sylvester in 1920, living at Little Sisters of the Poor, which was a you know, run by nuns, and they have here things wrong. We have the ship record, and these are both 20 years off. So, sometimes it is the records are wrong, and if you looked at this one and stopped there, you wouldn't find him because it's 20 years too early. So here's another one um, that I was doing for a friend. This is his great grandfather in the 1920 census. And there's these two men. I know his great grandfather's named Dayton Clark. And I find two men in 1920 named Dayton Clark in the census. And one was from the January 5th, one was January 6th. A 26-year-old, a 27-year-old, one's an auditor at the railway company, one's a bookkeeper at the textile mill. These are the addresses, head of household. Um, Dayton is listed as married, but his wife isn't there. And in one of them, there's a Dayton P. Clark Jr., just short of 2 years old. So, question for you guys. Is this one man or two? What do you think? Okay, let me show you. It is one man. I eventually found his passport application that had his address with this one, but also listed his father as his closest relative with this address. So I get both of these addresses in one document. Because, I didn't know, could they have been cousins named after the same grandmother's maiden name? So I was really glad I was able to do this, find this record. So I could indeed say, okay, one is the father-in-law from his first marriage, one's his father. Who knows who the informant is, but oops, close enough. So yeah, those of you who guessed one, that's right. We still haven't figured out who wife number two is. That's a whole mystery. Um, and you probably knew I'd get around to my Watermans at some point, right? Those of you who've been around and my, chasing Harriet. But I'm not going to talk about her much in this one. We're going to talk about her dad's second marriage. So, sometime around 1844-45, Lucius Waterman up and leaves his wife, Harriet, in Massachusetts. She has a son, James Waterman, in early 1844. But by 1845, there are letters at the post office, a couple post offices in Illinois, waiting for Lucius. So someone doesn't say who the letters are from, but somebody thinks he's out in Illinois in 1845 because there are like 5 or 6 letters for him. In 1849, in Wisconsin, he marries Rachel Schenck. I have found no trace of a divorce. When Lucius does die, the 3 children from his first marriage are listed as the children by a former wife in his will. So he hasn't just completely hidden that the way some men did. And I know Lucius and Rachel, with the second marriage, had at least 4 children: William, Garrett, Anna, and Edwin. Edwin dies young. The others grow up, get married, and pretty much die without surviving children. This is one I don't think I can track anyone down from that marriage. Or at least I haven't been able to yet. It all dead ends with people who died without kids. Um, so, but I have these other two people who show these names that show up in records that I'm not quite sure who they are because the records are contradicting. So I haven't solved this one yet. So we have, and I'll show you these, possibly a first child Eliza, and then possibly a straggler, oops baby named John. And yes, there's already a different John Waterman who would be half brothers, but stranger things have happened. So again, here's what it kind of looks like. Um, Eliza's a year old in the 1850 census. These three I have good records for. I have decent records for Edwin who died at 6. And then there's John. So in the 1900 federal census, Rachel Schenck Waterman says she's had 4 children and 3 are living, which is these 4 in the middle. But here we have 1850, and we have Lucas Waterman, Rachel, and Eliza. 1850 did not tell you relationships. So I suppose it's possible that it's a niece, nephew, child from Rachel's previous marriage. But if she's 1 year old in 1850, remember, Lucas and Rachel were married in October of 1849. So, it could be a child from a previous marriage, but that still leaves us with this problem if it's Rachel's child, because it would have to have been 5 children. So, too early for vital records, have not found a church record. I don't think they were religious. Um, so, and again, I wrote it out because that's the way of doing sort of here's what the evidence is. Then we have this one. This is in 1900, and we've got William Waterman, the oldest son of Lucius and Rachel, with his wife in they're in Chicago. They've been married 10 years. And then there's this brother, John W. Waterman, born in 1870. Um, Now, I've wondered whether it's his wife's brother, but if it were, you'd think that instead of, these are where William's parents were born, Vermont and New York, and it's the same for John. Now, it could be the census taker just assumed it was William's brother and just filled those in instead of France and Indiana. But this is a real puzzle because, who is this John? Um, I have not been able to find other records that are clearly him. And the John from the first marriage has died before this. I have that record. He died in Virginia in the 1880s. So, and again, I wrote it out. Here's pro and con. Um, I'm not expecting you to read all of this because, you know, it's too much, but just to show you how I will often do something like this. Of here's why I think one thing and here's why I think the other.
No, 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 no.
So that's sort of an introduction to conflicting evidence. So, any questions at this point? No questions. I'm going to stop the recording.